Hi everyone, this is the first chapter of my Flutter REST API crash course where you will learn how to build this coronavirus tracker application. This chapter is available for free here on YouTube and you will be able to find the full paid course on this page at courses.codewithandrea.com. So here are all the videos for the first chapter of this course. Welcome to this crash course about using REST APIs with Flutter. In this first part of the course, we will master the basics of REST and the Dart HTTP library. Once you have this knowledge, you'll be able to write Flutter apps that can tap into thousands of web APIs. And when I say thousands, I mean it. And if you don't believe me, you can go on this GitHub page, which is a collective list of free APIs that you can use in your own apps. And as you can see, the list is endless, and I could go on and on and on. And the majority of these APIs are based on REST. So before we write any code, I want to give you an overview of what a RESTful API is. And to start off, we need to talk about client-server communication. So here we have a client and a server, and you can think of REST as a standardized protocol that the client can use to communicate with the server. The client can make a request by using a certain method to interact with the server. For example, if the client wants to read some data from the server, it can send a GET request. And the meaning of GET is that we only want to read data without modifying any state on the server. The server will then respond with a status code and a payload that contains the data that the client has requested. So if everything went well, the server will respond with a status code of 200. But if the request was invalid or something went wrong, then the server can respond with a 400 or a 500 error. Typically, a 400 error means that the client did something wrong or requested some data that is not accessible, while a 500 status code is reserved for server errors and may indicate that the server is unavailable or there was a timeout. And if the client wants, it can send a POST request along with some data that needs to be saved on the server. And if this operation completes successfully, then the server can respond with a 201 status code to confirm that the data was created. GET and POST are known as HTTP methods. And in addition to these, clients can also use put, patch, and delete. They all work in a similar way, and the client can choose the most appropriate one depending on what it wants to do. In summary, REST is a protocol that is used for client-server communication. The client can send a request to the server by using any of these HTTP methods, and the server can respond with 200, 300, 400, or 500 status codes along with a payload. And I should also mention that the server sends a payload in a specific format, and the most common formats are JSON, HTML, and XML. HTML and XML are typically used when requesting the pages of a website because they can be used to define how the data should be presented by the browser. Instead, when we build a mobile app, we are interested in just getting the data, and it is the code inside the client that decides how the data should be presented. So in this course, we will focus on working with REST APIs, and we are going to read and parse data in JSON format. For now, this is all you need to know about REST. And if you want to learn more, you can check the links at the end of this video. Next, it's time to talk about the REST API that we are going to use in this course. So let's continue on the next video. In this video, we are going to learn about the nCoV 2019 API, which is the API that we will use to build our coronavirus tracker application. The nCoV 2019 API is free to use. And in order to find this API, you can open your browser and type in this URL in the address bar. Once you are on this page, you can select the API nCoV 2019 version 1.0.0 over here, and this takes you to the main page for this API. By the way, I'd like to mention that there are also other coronavirus APIs that we could use to build our application. But I've chosen to use this one because from an educational point of view, it is the most interesting one to learn. And while the API is free, in order to use it, you need to register an account so that you can get an API key that you can use in your app. So in this video, we will go through the process of setting things up so that we can use this API in our Flutter application. So let's get started by pressing this button that says Visit Publisher Store. And the first step is to sign up for a new account using this option on the top right corner. This will take you through a screen where you can register with an email address and a password, so make sure that you fill up this information and accept the terms and conditions down here. And once you have done this, your account will be created and you'll be taken to this screen where you can enter your username and password and start using the API. Once you have signed in, you will see that your username shows up over here. And then you need to create a new application so that you can get some production and sandbox keys that you can use to make requests. So over here, we're going to select new application. And here we need to give it a name, for example, coronavirus tracker. And we're going to leave the default value on this option, and we can select add to create the application. Then we get this pop-up, and here we can confirm that we want to get back to the API detail page. And from here, we can select the application that we have just created, and then we can press this subscribe button. And from here, we can press this button to view our subscriptions. So if you completed all the previous steps, you should now see this subscription with a status of published. And as a next step, we need to generate some sandbox or production keys that we can use to work with the API. So if we open the sandbox keys tab, we can see a warning telling us that no keys are found. And if we scroll down, we can find this button that says generate keys. So let's press that. Once you have done this, this page will update and show two values called consumer key and consumer secret. And you can choose to show or hide them by pressing this button over here. So once your keys are visible, you can scroll down and then you can copy not the first, but this second curl command. And then you can paste it in your terminal. And if you run this, then the API should respond with an access token that looks like this. So if you get an access token at this stage, it means that your configuration was successful. Next, I want to point out that you can regenerate the access token at any time by pressing this regenerate button over here. And you can also change the validity of the access token. By default, this is 3600 seconds, which is equivalent to 1 hour. This means that after this time has passed, then the access token will expire and you will need to generate a new one if you want to use the API. And we'll get back to the implications of this when we build our mobile app with Flutter. Okay, so our setup is complete, and this means that we can start using the API. To do that, we can select this APIs tab on the top left corner. And then here we're going to select the nCoV 2019 API once again. And then we can open this tab called API Console. And since we generated keys for the sandbox environment, here we can select sandbox. And as we can see, this request header called authorization bearer is pre-filled with the access token that we have generated in the previous step. And we will talk more in detail about this authorization header a bit later. But for now, the interesting thing is that we have access to these 5 different API endpoints that we can use to get the latest data on coronavirus. So here we can look at this first endpoint called cases. And if we select it, it opens up a panel with more detailed information. So by inspecting this page, we can learn more about how to use this endpoint. For example, we can see that this is a GET request, and we can preview an example response that we would get if we call this endpoint. We can see that the response type is application/JSON, and we can also inspect the parameters that we could send along with our request to get specific data by country. And we can also see the possible errors that are returned by this endpoint. And if we want, we can even press this button to make a request, and this will expand this panel with additional information. And this shows us how to make this request from the command line with the curl command, along with some information about the request and response data. And if we scroll down, we can inspect the remaining endpoints as well. For example, to find out the number of deaths from coronavirus, I can open this endpoint, and if I try it over here, once again, I can get all the request and response data. In summary, the API console is a very good way of exploring this API directly from the browser. We can use it as reference documentation to understand how to use the API, and we can make requests as well and see the response data. Throughout this course, we will see how to call this API directly from Dart so that we can fetch and show the data inside the Flutter application. And while this course will focus on how to use this specific API, many other API providers also offer a console that looks like this. So I think it was valuable to show you how to use it. And before we move on, I just want to summarize the steps that you need to follow when you want to integrate a new REST API in your applications. Normally, you would have to register a new account with an API provider so that you can get some API keys. And you may be able to generate separate production and sandbox keys. Once you have an API key, you can use it to get an access token. An access token is a string that you can send along when you make requests to the remaining API endpoints. Access tokens often have an expiration time, and once they expire, they can't be used anymore, and you need to get a new one. And we will see what's the best way of doing this when we build our Flutter app. Finally, by making requests, you can get data from the RESTful API, and you can show it in the UI of your application. Before we move on, I also want to mention that there are some other types of authentication systems that can be used to access REST APIs. So in this course, we will cover API keys only, but just so you know, there are many APIs that don't require any authentication at all, and many others that use OAuth. And you can find more information about OAuth in the links included with this lesson. Okay, so let's continue on the next video. In the last video, we have explored the nCoV 2019 API, and we have learned about API keys and access tokens. Our next step is to work out how to use this API inside VS Code. So in this video, we will create a new Flutter project, and we will learn about how to use REST client, which is a VS Code extension that we can use to send HTTP requests and view the response directly in Visual Studio Code. And we will see how to call our nCoV 2019 API with REST client. So here I have a new Visual Studio Code window, and just as a reminder, you need to have both the Dart and Flutter extensions installed in order to continue. Okay, so as a first step, we want to open the command palette up here, and then we want to select Flutter New Project. And we are going to call this Coronavirus REST API Flutter course, and make sure to use all lowercase characters and underscores to separate between words. And then we can press enter, and then we can choose a folder where we want to place our project. So feel free to choose any folder that you wish. And after we have done this, Visual Studio Code will create and configure our project. This might take a little while, so I'm going to pause the video here and resume when it's complete. Our project is now complete, and our next step is to install REST client. To do this, we can open the command palette once again, and this time we can type install extensions, and then on this search box we can type REST client, like this. And the one that we want to select is this one. Now, in my case, I have it already installed, but in your case, you will see an install button over here. So make sure to install it, and after that, it should look like this. So once this extension is installed, we can close this window and get back to the File Explorer. And if we go to the blank space in the project folder, we can right click and create a new folder called REST_API. And then inside here, we can create a new file called nCoV_2019_API.http. So what can we do with this file? Well, the idea is that we can use it to encode all the various API calls that we want to use in our project so that we can run them directly from here. So we will add all the various calls one by one, but just to show you the end result, this is what we will have at the end of this section. So at the top, we have one post request that we can use to get an access token. And after that, we have 5 different requests for each of the endpoints that are supported by the nCoV 2019 API. And one thing that you might notice is that these requests make use of variables that are defined inside double curly braces. These are called environment variables, and we will see where to store them and how to use them. So let me focus on this first request and delete all the other ones for now. This request is what we use to get the access token, and somewhere in our project we need to define two variables called base URL and authorization. So for now, let's just add them in this file. And to define a variable inside the current file, we can type @base URL and then equals, and then we need to specify the base URL for the nCoV API. If we head back to the browser, we can find this value over here, so we can copy the left portion of this line all the way up to 443, which is the port number, and paste it over here. Next, we need to define this authorization variable as well. So here I can type @authorization, and here I can type test just to see what happens. And now that these variables are defined, I can save the file and I can click on this label that says send request. And as we can see, we get a new panel on this side, and the response says 401 unauthorized, and the description below tells us that the authorization header could not be decoded. So our next step is to work out what value we should use for the authorization variable. And to find that out, we can head back to the nCoV 2019 API console, and then we want to open the applications list. And here we can select the application that we have created. And then if we go to sandbox keys, we can scroll down to reveal the curl command that is used to generate an access token. And over here, we can see that we have this header called authorization basic, and then base 64 with consumer key and consumer secret. So the authorization variable that we want is a function of the consumer key and the consumer secret. And if we want, we can find out what this value is by hitting show keys over here. And when we do this, we can see that the curl prompt changes and now shows the actual authorization key. Now, one thing that I should mention is that consumer keys and secrets are very sensitive information, and you should take special care to ensure that no one gets access to them. In fact, in post-processing, I've obscured them in this video. In any case, just for testing purposes, you can copy this string value that you see over here, and if you get back to Visual Studio Code, and you can paste it over here. And after you have done this, you can send the request once again, and this time we can see that the response is 200 OK, and the response body contains a valid access token. So this is great because it means that we can use REST client to call our API and get the response data. Okay, so let's continue on the next video. Before we continue, I want to address a security problem, because it's likely that in a real project we would save this file to version control, and we don't really want to expose our authorization header like this, especially if we create a public GitHub repository. Instead, we need to store this authorization variable somewhere safe that we could then exclude from version control. So it would be convenient if we could save configuration variables such as the base URL and the authorization key into a file so that they are visible when we send our requests. Luckily, the REST client supports environment variables, and the way this works is that we can define multiple environments inside a settings file, and we can add key value pairs to each environment to define our variables. So if you head over to the main web page for the REST client extension on the Visual Studio Marketplace and you scroll down, you will find this section that explains how to use variables. And over here, there is an example settings file that can be used to define environment variables for this extension. So what we are going to do is to copy this snippet of code, and then we can get back to VS Code, and at the root of the project, we can create a new folder called .vscode, and inside here we can add a new file called settings.json. Now this is a JSON file, so we are going to add a couple of curly braces, and inside here we can paste the contents from the browser. Okay, so we have now created a valid settings JSON file, and what we want to do next is to configure the environments and variables that we need for our API. So over here, I can remove this shared section because I don't need it. And here I can rename this section from local to sandbox. And the idea is that we can store different variables for the sandbox and production environments. To do that, we can clear these key value pairs from here and from here. And inside the sandbox environment, we can define a base URL variable with an empty value for now, and also an authorization key with an empty string, like this. And now that I've done this, I can save this file, and if I get back to the HTTP file, I can now copy the base URL and paste it in here, and I can also copy the authorization key and paste it in here. And if I save this file now, I can get back to the HTTP file and I can remove these variables because the ones from the settings file will be used instead. Now, one thing that I want to point out is that before we run this request, we should choose which environment we want to run on. To do that, we can click on this option on the bottom right corner so that we can choose between no environment, sandbox, and production. And if we select no environment, we can see that we have some errors because these variables are not defined. But if we select sandbox, then everything works fine. So this is great because we now have a convenient way of switching between environments. So if we register some production keys later on, we'll be able to set them on the settings file and use them to send requests. For now, we can stay in sandbox mode. And if we send this request again, we can see that we get a successful response. Okay, so before we go any further, I want to do one more step, and that is to initialize a new Git repository for this project. To do that, I can open the terminal from here, and inside the root of the project, I can type git init. This creates a new Git repository for our project, and I will use this to commit all the changes that I make from lesson to lesson. And as you can see, after I run this command, all the files on the Explorer become green because we haven't saved our changes to Git just yet. And now that we have a Git repo, we can add a new file inside this .vs code folder and call this .gitignore, like this. And inside this file, I'm going to add one line called settings.json. And by doing this, I can exclude this file from the repository so that we don't accidentally commit it to version control. As you can see, this file is now green, but once I save the gitignore file, it becomes dark blue, and this indicates that it has been excluded from Git. So I'm not going to talk about Git and version control any longer in this course, but for now, I just wanted to show you how to exclude files with sensitive data from Git, so that we don't commit any secret keys to our repository. Okay, so let's continue on the next video. In the last video, we have seen how to use environment variables with REST client, and our next step is to get the access token that we get when we make this request and save it as an environment variable so that we can use it to call the remaining API endpoints. So let's send this request one more time, and this time we are going to copy the access token that we get from the response, and then we can open the settings.json file, and here we can add a new line and add a key called access token, and the value is going to be the token that we got from our response, like this. And now that we have this, we can try to call one of the other API endpoints so that we can get data for cases of coronavirus. So let's see how we can do this. And here I can add 3 hash signs to indicate that I want to define a new request. Over here, I'm going to add a get request, and I need to specify the request URL. We can find this on the reference page for the nCoV 2019 API, so we can copy this URL from here, and I believe the other ones would work as well. And then back in Visual Studio Code, we can paste it over here. And since the API console shows multiple endpoints that I could use, I need to choose one. So in VS Code, I'm going to append /cases at the end, so that my full URL matches the one that is used by the API console. And since I've already defined a base URL as an environment variable, I'm going to use it here. So rather than having this URL written like this, I'm going to use double curly braces, and I can use base URL inside it. Then I need to define a couple of request headers. The first one is going to be accept with a value of application/JSON. And finally, I need to specify an authorization header and pass the access token that I have saved in my settings file. And now my request definition is complete. And if I click on send request, I can see that I get a 200 OK response. And here in the response body, I get the number of cases of coronavirus. And this confirms that we are using the access token that we have configured in the settings file. And now that we have managed to get one of these endpoints to work, it's easy to add the remaining ones. In fact, all we have to do is to copy these lines and add 4 more endpoints. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now that we have done this, we need to update the end of each URL to match the endpoints on the API console. So let's do that. And here I'm going to have cases/suspected. And here cases/confirm. And then this one is going to be deaths. And this one is going to be recovered. Like this. And if we want, at this stage, we can test each of these endpoints. So let's try to get the number of suspected cases. So I can send this request. And this time I've got a 401 unauthorized response. And the reason for that is that the access token has expired. To deal with this, we can request a new access token by running this request at the top. And now we can copy the new access token from the response. And then we can open the settings file and we can update it over here. And now that we have done this, we can get back to our requests and we're going to send this once again. And this time we can see that the status code is 200 OK because the access token is now valid and we get the number of suspected cases. In summary, we have now managed to configure our REST API directly in Visual Studio Code with the REST client extension. And by using REST client, the API that we need is more easily testable and also documented right inside our project. And in fact, having this HTTP file in the project will be very handy when we will implement the API service for our Flutter application. Before we move on, I want to mention that REST client has a lot of useful features, so I encourage you to check the documentation and try it out in your own projects. And with this, we have concluded the first section of this course. And this means that we can start building our coronavirus Flutter application. So let's continue on the next section. We have reached the end of this section. If you liked this, you can enroll for my full course at courses.codewithandrea.com, which will contain additional content that I will not cover here on YouTube. If this has been useful, please like and subscribe for more Flutter videos. Thank you very much for watching and I'll see you on the next video.